Dune. Now there's a name known by most sci-fi fans and a lot of gamers. The book series written by Frank Herbert is among the best you'll ever read, as long as you don't read too many of them, because at one point they stop being all that good and more not good, not terrible either, just not as good as it was at first. There have been a lot of adaptations of Dune. Some of them were movies, some of them kinda weren't that good, and quite a few of them were games, a long time ago. The one you probably know best is Dune 2, the game that gave us the RTS genre, and yet it wasn't the first one. There have been plans to adapt Dune as a game ever since the Atari 2600, but it wasn't until 1992 that we actually got an adaptation. Well, we got two of them in the same year. One was Dune 2, the building of a dynasty, the Battle of Arrakis, whatever you want to call it, and the other one was just Dune, made by a studio named Cryo Interactive from France, and well, this is quite possibly the most faithful adaptation of Dune ever made. Because, well, Dune 2 and its many sequels had the combat aspect down, but Dune wasn't just about combat. It actually had very little of the combat you see in Dune 2, that army versus army style of fighting. No, it didn't really have that. It had more of a guerrilla warfare feel to it. And for the most part, the book was about politics, about religion, about humanity. Not something you can explore all that well in an RTS game, no matter how many cinematics it has with genre status. So Dune was something else. It was an adventure game. Well, partly an adventure game. The other part was a strategy game, a real-time strategy game on a fairly grand scale. You had just about the entire planet. It even had a very similar concept of harvesting spice and using it as a main resource to buy equipment, to buy units, to buy things. And of course you harvested that spice with harvesters. What else would you use? Only it wasn't made in the same way that the Westwood game was constructed. Namely, you didn't have different units, though you could equip the Fremen with different stuff, like atomics and thopters and all sorts of other things. Also, the enemy AI was a bit, non-existent would be a fair description. What I'm getting at is that this game wasn't all that hard to beat. It was, in retrospect, quite easy, and yet it did something the other Dune games maybe didn't do so well, especially the ones after Dune 2. Immersion. It made you feel like you were on Dune. It made you feel like you were there. It made you feel Arrakis. And yet, this game was almost never made. The story goes that around 1988, an executive at Virgin Interactive named Martin Alper tried to get the rights for Dune from Dino De Laurentiis, who owned the rights then because of the movie. He wanted Dune to be a video game, and well, didn't succeed in buying them. And yet that didn't stop him from actually trying to make a video game about it. Going to the point where he talked with several studios, several teams, including one from France, made up by people like Philippe Ulrich and Rémi Herbulin, who had what seemed to be a really good idea for a Dune game. Now eventually they did get the rights from Universal, and that team, who went on to be known as Cryo Interactive, began working on a game. Now I've heard two versions of this story. One of them, well, has more technical details like audits, Sega taking over Virgin's operation in Europe, and well, basically it sounds more like the real deal. But the other one was so fun. The basic idea is that Virgin decided to not go through with the Cryo game. They didn't have a contract, just a verbal agreement with the studio, so instead of making that Dune game, they wanted to make another one, a strategy game with Westwood, because it was more what they wanted it to be. And yet Cryo didn't want to stop working on the game, so they kept working on it. Now in one version they actually had mostly a finished game and then just sent it off to Virgin, which showed it to Westwood, and Westwood was impressed and they got the go ahead to finish the game. And in the version that's more believable, development was actually being funded by Sega, who had bought out some of Virgin Interactive's business in Europe. Though there was a problem, Sega didn't didn't own Dune, so they couldn't actually publish it. That's when Cryo went to Virgin again in London and showed off their new prototype of the game. And this time the game's producer, a man by the name of David Bishop, who had previously called the project as being aesthetically and stylistically too French, along with Martin Olper, who just wanted the Dune game, were impressed with what they saw and gave it the go-ahead, so the game was uncancelled, even though they were already working on another Dune game with Westwood, the RTS one. They gave Cryo Interactive 5 weeks to make another prototype that would be more suited for the American audience, and they did. And so, over the course of about half a year, they built Dune and released it in January 1992 before the Westwood game, which is why that one is called Dune 2, even though there is no relation between them, apart from both being games about Dune. The Cryo Interactive game was a success from what I understand. It sold around 20,000 units in its first week, this in the US alone, and then it got bundled with Dune 2, making it a sort of Dune variety pack, if you will. And what really set it apart was, well, apart from the fact that it's one of the few games that actually gets Dune proper, well, at least adapts Dune from the movie with slight hints from the book and does it in a competent way that reflects more of Dune than just fighting. It also had something that really made it shine. Well, it had two things. The first one was the graphics. They were fantastic at the time. They were marvelous. Sure, to you now they may be just pixely things, but when I first played it I was impressed. When the camera just zoomed on another character's face to show their eyes, my god, that was astonishing. And at that time I had no idea there was actually a CGI version of the game. Well, a CD version that used CGI for the environment and for a lot of stuff. And that CD version also had one huge advantage over the floppy version, which is the other thing that made this game stand apart: the music. Now, as much as I love Frank Lepacki's music in Dune 2, this music was atmospheric as all hell, and the CD version was just phenomenal. I'm not gonna play any of it because it may be copyrighted, but you can find it on YouTube. Just search for Dune the Spice Opera. It's about an hour's worth of music from this game. It's the kind of music you can just listen to. I would sometimes just stay in the game to listen to that music. Some of those tracks, they were marvelous. Sadly not the one where you travel to Norntopter because that's usually the worst one, but a lot of the music was and still is great. And the game itself, although it's about as easy as games can get, there is a charm to it. There is a feeling to it, something that draws me to it again and again. It feels like Dune. It looks like Dune, which is honestly something I can't say for most of the other games. It's probably the whole aesthetic, because the way this game and its sequel looked sort of defined what Dune was to me, and I don't really see that in Dune 2000 or Emperor Battle for Dune. There were at some point plans to port this game to just about every platform. It made it onto a few, and there was also the idea to remake it, sort of, but in a way that let you play as the Harkonnen, which would have been great but never happened. Well, yes, Westwood did make games where you played as the Harkonnen, but they were strategy games. This one was an adventure strategy game. It had more to it. It could be more. Now, Cryo did make a sort of remake sequel type thing, which was an adventure action game, which was developed around 2001 by basically none of the original people, which was one of the worst games ever made. I'm not joking, it's atrocious, it's bad, at maybe not as bad as Big Rigs Over the Road Racing, but it's still damn close. And with that game, the Dune series died. All that and Emperor Battle for Dune, which was a better game, much better game. And there hasn't been a Dune game since. Hasn't been a Dune game in 15 years. And you can't even find most of them on sale anymore, though they are available on some abandonware sites, because at this point they're basically abandonware. They're unattended by any copyright holder. I can't help but to wonder why haven't there been more attempts to make another Dune game? Well, maybe because there hasn't been that much going on with Dune in the past decade or so. No new movies, no new adaptations, no real marketing for a game company to latch onto and promote the game. It would have to be good from the get-go, which for licensed stuff is kind of a hard thing to sell. Though there was at one time an attempt to make a game called, I believe, Dune Generations, which was supposed to be akin to an MMO. It sadly died, even though it sounded like it could have been a good idea. If you find Dune anywhere, I encourage you to play it. It's actually quite playable today. I'd say it's more playable than Dune 2 is. Though if you find Frank Herbert's Dune, because they even misspelled the name, I encourage you to either run the other way fast or laugh at it, and at times be utterly horrified at parts of it. If you enjoyed this show, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Or, if you thought it was horrible, then share it with your enemies and make them suffer. We shall be your weapon of vengeance. But if you liked what you saw, you could, I don't know, maybe donate, because basically YouTube is horrible at revenue, by using the link in the description, or just buy my book. It's a fantasy book about, well, a lot of stuff. I guarantee it won't suck, and if it does suck, you can find me here and complain about it.